Welcome to the Fraternity Foodie Podcast. This is the top podcast for college students and college administrators to geek out with the positives, the negatives, and everything in between that's happening on your campus. It's time to ask the difficult questions and find real solutions. We are talking to the best guest on the planet about fraternities, sororities, college life, and of course, we're looking for great food in college towns all across North America. And here is your host, speaker, entrepreneur, resident foodie, and Greek University CEO, Mike Ayalon.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to episode number 84 of Fraternity Foodie. I am your host, Mike Ayalon, CEO of Greek University. We call these episodes Fraternity Foodie because there is nothing like great food to bring people together. We have an incredible program for you today. We have with us Rudy Rochman, a Jewish and Israel rights activist and social media influencer. He's on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. He was born in Paris. He moved to Israel at age 3, and then at age 7, he experienced anti-Semitism after being removed from a bus in London. Since then, he has been focused on Jewish rights. Rudy is a brother of AAPI from Columbia University. We can't wait to share his knowledge and his experience with all of our listeners all across the country today. Welcome to the show, Rudy.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, it's a pleasure. So let's get into your story because I'm just fascinated by, just everything that has happened here. At the age of 17, you voluntarily enlisted in the Israel Defense Forces. You were a sniper in the 101st Paratrooper Brigade. So you're still a reservist today, of course. And so what was that experience like heading into the IDF?
For sure. So for me, I grew up all around in different places, and I had a very sort of a struggle with identity growing up, because growing up particularly in Miami, which we moved to after living in Israel for a few years, no one was really from America. Even if you were born or raised in America and in Miami, no one really identified as American. Right. So someone was Argentinian, Venezuelan, Colombian, Haitian, Jamaican, Cuban, and I was always labeled the French kid since I was born in France. But when I'd visit family in France, all of a sudden I was the American cousin, and I'm also Israeli, I'm also Jewish, I'm also Moroccan, and apparently who I am depends on who's asking me that question or where that question is being asked. So I developed a sort of frustration with that, and after my experience with my first sort of taste of anti-Semitism at the age of 7, where we were kicked off that bus, that moment sort of taught me who I was, because it didn't matter where I was born, where I grew up, where I lived in, where I traveled to, I was a Jew. And I understood that being a Jew was not just this ideology that spread across borders, but it was sort of a preservation portable suitcase tool that was built to preserve the identity of a native people from Judea. That is where my ancestors come from. So from that moment on, I saw myself as Jewish, as being part of the nation of Israel. And if that country and civilization exists again, since it was revived in 1948, that makes me Israeli. And every Israeli has to do the army. So why would I be any different and not also serve my country and protect my country? So for me, it was very clear from a young age that when I reached of age 17, 18, I'd go to Israel and I'd join the army, which I did. It was an amazing and fulfilling experience where I really felt day in and day out that I was protecting the civilians that were living in the country and making sure that this country exists. So for me, it was one of the most fulfilling experiences that I've ever had in my life. It taught me a lot about discipline, of being able to work with others, of pushing my body and my mind to extremes that I think most people that haven't gone through such experiences don't know that we can actually go through such extremes. And yeah, overall taught me a lot and continued to grow from there.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. And I love that portable suitcase that you talk about. I've read that before, and I think it's a great expression because we really do bring with us culture, language, everything, food. I mean, you name it, it all is in this suitcase, right?
That's right.
So I definitely identify with that, and I like where you're coming from there. What's interesting is you decided to attend Columbia University despite the fact that it was the #1 most anti-Semitic school in the country. So I'm wondering, how did you arrive at this decision to attend Columbia?
Right. So when I was in the Army in 2013 and a little bit before, there was an operation called Amud Anan, Pillar of Defense. And during that time, I wasn't able to get off of the border of Gaza for about 6 months. And that was the time that I was also supposed to submit my college applications for me to go into university post getting out of the army. So I had missed actually the dates of submitting the application. So eventually, when I finished the army, I had to either wait a year to apply and get into the university of my choice, or start by going to Santa Monica College and going to UCLA Extension, where I was able to take classes at UCLA at the same time, and then I'd be able to transfer. So instead of wasting a year, I decided to go through that track. And when I started both at UCLA and Santa Monica College is when I started to experience the anti-Israel, anti-Jewish movements on college campuses, which claims to be pro-Palestinian, but the reason I argue that it's not is because when Palestinians are suffering, by the thousands dying in Syria, they don't talk about them. By the hundreds of thousands in refugee camps in Lebanon, they don't talk about them. Suffering on the border of Gaza and Egypt, they don't talk about them. It's sort of, they take the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, they take all context out of it and manipulate the real suffering that exists there in order to create a zero-sum game of one versus the other. When in reality, if you're anti-Palestinian or anti-Israel, you're actually anti-both, because neither population will disappear. And in order for us, all the locals, inhabitants that live here, we're going to have to find a way to live together. When I realized that there was a movement that was not only seeking to alienate the Jewish people, demonize the Jewish people, delegitimize our history, our identity, and our right to sovereignty and self-determination in the land, I realized that the way they were spreading this was through the use of intersectionality and going to every single minority group on college campuses and convincing them that the source of their suffering was also the Jewish people, which is exactly how anti-Semitism has been spread throughout time. I mean, you look at Hitler, he blamed the Jews for the economic situation in Germany because that was the source of suffering of that community. And how they're doing it is they're going to the Black Student Association saying, oh, you suffer from police brutality and racism. Well, Israel's doing the same thing to the Palestinians, and even more so, Israel's doing that and teaching that to the American police, which is ridiculous. And then they're going to Native Americans. Some white colonialists came and stole their land. Well, the Jews are a bunch of fake white people from Europe that stole their land, which isn't true. Mexico, they're building a wall. We already have a wall. And they're basically making the argument to all these minorities that their suffering, which they fight and need help fighting, is the same thing that Israel is causing to others and also to them, which is exactly how anti-Semitism has been spread throughout time. Now it's just rebranded using Israel as a cover. So when I realized that, I started to look from within. What is the Jewish community doing with that? What are our allies doing? How are we responding? How are we communicating? And what I found out, which was very troubling, is that the response to this sort of movement that was countering our legitimacy, identity, and right to exist was basically, let's create these events once in a blue moon in our own Hillels and AAPI houses and Chabads and basically Jewish community centers, and let's just celebrate Israel. Let's do an event about the technology that Israel invented, the cherry tomatoes, the ways, the drip irrigation. You know, we'll do like a little hummus and Israeli music party night, but we won't actually go out and speak to people, engage people, convince people, create a more holistic vision and version of the reality that includes both sides, that counters the false, hoods that are being spread. And I realized that was the problem. The reason why there's so much anti-Semitism is not necessarily because anti-Semites are doing a good job. It's because the Jews and their allies are doing a bad job. And that's what made me sort of say, you know what, all of my friends now are transferring to different universities, and I'm speaking to the parents of my friends and are saying, oh, I'm not putting my child there. It's too anti-Semitic, it's too anti-Israel. I'm like, that's actually where we should be going. We should be going to the toughest schools to have those conversations. So I did a Google search right when I was transferring. Number one most anti-Semitic school in North America, Columbia University came up number one. And I said, you know what, not only did I always want to live in New York, but that's where I'm going to go so that no one can ever make an excuse again as to why we can't be able to stand up for ourselves on these campuses.
Wow, that's absolutely incredible. Now things are starting to make a lot more sense to me, because at Columbia, you founded the grassroots pro-Israel movement on campus. It eventually became the strongest university Zionist group in the world with over 800 members. So how did you grow the organization at Columbia to that level?
So it was not right away. It took some time, 2.5 years at Columbia. But the way we did that is by creating an inclusive vision, meaning we were not left wing, right wing, one state, two state. Of course, each individual can have their own opinions, but our goal was very clear: to empower, to educate, and to expose. The first part of empowerment means we need to give the tools to the next generation of Jews and allies to be able to stand up and defend ourselves. So how to do public speaking, how to debate, how to talk about Israel to the left, how to talk about Israel to the right, how to be able to communicate messages with your professor, even if the professor's anti-Israel, how to understand other narratives that are counter to our narratives and be able to either find a place that is holistic and inclusive of both narratives, or being able to counter things that are completely false. And these are tools that were not given to most Jews in the diaspora, because most Jews in the diaspora being raised, especially the way I was raised also, not in my home, but at school and seeing my peers, we were taught about how to be Jews in theory and not in practice. So how to know the prayers and the traditions and the holidays, but not how to be a Jew today facing the anti-Semitism that we face. So our first and primary goal was to obviously create an inclusive thing, a space where many people can be a part of it, but first and foremost to empower. Second is to educate. And so when we're trying to teach the campus to narrate the story of Israel, we have to use the language of our generation. And the language of your generation doesn't necessarily speak in facts and in achievements, but more so in deeper messages that have more meaning, that have more of an understanding. So yeah, America exists, but why? Yeah, other countries exist in this world, but why? You know, is it legitimate? Is it moral? Was it ethical? What happened? And so for me, the story of Israel isn't the story of a startup nation that created amazing technology and is the only democracy in the Middle East. Like, yes, that also is a part of our story, but the legitimacy of why Israel has a right to exist isn't because of that. Because if you look at, Jordan, which is a monarchy, and Thailand, which is a monarchy, and Singapore, which is a beautiful country, but a semi-dictatorship, no one is questioning their legitimacy based on the way that they govern themselves. So why are we using the way that we govern themselves to sort of get legitimacy? That doesn't give you a right to exist just because you do what you're supposed to do. And if anything, I don't expect anything less of the Jewish people than having a democracy. If anything, I expect us to create something even better than the current democracies that exist out there. So I don't think we should be using this as a sort of chip for legitimacy. And the fundamental question on campuses today is, why does Israel have a right to exist? And who are the Jewish people? So the way we've communicated that message, which is a more inclusive way, is the story of Israel is the story of a 4,000-year-old native people from the land of Judea, Israel, that were physically displaced from their homeland by a Western white imperial nation called the Romans. They still maintained a constant presence in the land even during their displacement. And after 2,000 years of persecution, extermination, and oppression, we eventually created the most successful indigenous liberation movement that ever existed, where for the first time in history, native people revived their language, revived their civilization by kicking off the oppressive British colonial force, and revive their civilization. And so when you tell Israel in that language, all of a sudden it makes sense as to why Israel exists. It's not just a safe place post the Holocaust. It's because this is reestablishing the story of all other native peoples, just the successful aspirations for the Jews. It's like the Native Americans succeeding, the Tibetans, the Yazidis, the Kurds, the Aboriginals, the Maoris. We succeeded in our aspirations. And so that's the second element. And the third element was to expose, meaning any movement that seeks to demonize, delegitimize, any sort of thing against the Jewish people in Israel, we need to be able to expose it, whether that's from the far right and the far left. And we did many events countering the lies and exposing people for actually hijacking the space that Palestinians need to talk about their genuine suffering and their future and their aspirations and their culture, and using that space in order to target Israel. And we were exposing what they were actually doing, and eventually a lot of their coalitions were able to break. A lot of people started to come to our movement. We were doing also very interesting events that weren't only about, let me show you about Zionism 101, but an event, for example, called Indigenous Unite, where we brought a Tibetan, a Yazidi, a Kurd, a Native American, and a Jew all together on a panel, sharing our stories, struggles, and aspirations that is common throughout all peoples that are indigenous peoples, but showing how the Jews actually achieved their aspirations. That's the only difference. So we did very interesting events. We also were always like the talk of the campus, because we did things that are pretty loud. For example, one time we had a plane with a sky banner that says Jews indigenous to Judea, #Hebrew Liberation Week, and it flew on the campus for a few hours. And of course, that sparked conversations. So because of our actions that were always about positivity, never about negativity, never about attacking anyone, only about sharing the truth and being able to create a space that was more inclusive, many people started to join, and this movement and this idea of what we created there eventually spread to many other campuses and many other communities across the world.
That is incredible. Now I see why this happened. The other thing is, like many other Jewish college students all over the world, you decided to join AAPI fraternity. So I'm wondering, what made you choose AAPI, and why is that organization important to you?
Sure. So AAPI I actually joined while I was at UCLA. And
Uh,
since I transferred to Columbia, my brotherhood transferred there to Columbia as well. Because once you're an AAPI brother, you're an AAPI brother for life. At first, this idea of college fraternity and parties wasn't something that I was so interested by because I was already post the army and I was more interested in starting my life and figuring out what I wanted to do and put my energies into something productive. But AAPI is not only about this, standard fraternity life that you see in the movies of parties and drinking and having fun, but also something that has meaning in it. The way that API was even founded, it was I believe in 1913 by brothers in New York City at NYU that were rejected from being part of a fraternity because they were Jewish. So they decided, you know what, we need a space for us to educate the next generation on Jewish values, on what is good, what is wrong, what is important, which we invest our efforts in philanthropy work and invest in building coalitions with other communities. And so that's how API was founded. And till this day, I think it's the only Jewish fraternity that exists. Of course, there were other Jewish fraternities like SAMI and ZBT, which used to be Jewish, but since then became inclusive for all, where API maintain its Jewish identity and really tries to empower the next generation through a ton of events that they do on, why is it important to be Jewish? What does it mean? How do we support Israel? How do we become activists? And in 2013, when I first started university, both at UCLA and Santa Monica College, is when they tried to pass a BDS resolution for the first time. And the group on campus that was really fighting against BDS was AAPI. So for me, it was a space to enter in order to stand up for my values and what I believe in and fighting for truth. And I realized also during that fight, a lot of things that led me to the conclusion of, I want to go to Columbia. I want to start doing this, on a deeper and much more important level than just, coming out and supporting or giving a speech. This is a fight that I need to take upon myself to change the way the narrative is taught about Israel, because no one else was doing it.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that you found AAPI, and I know they're sure glad to have you as a member, because you are just a force. That is just incredible. I also want to talk about the media, because there was a video that was circulating recently on social media. It was an elderly Palestinian man who was being arrested by an Israeli soldier. And I was wondering if you can talk to us a little bit more about some of the questions that you had on this particular portrayal in the media, because it does seem like there's a lot of manipulation that's happening here to get people onto a particular side.
Right. So first of all, we need to understand that the reality that people are suffering on both sides is true. There is suffering that Palestinians deal with that is different than what Israelis deal with, and vice versa. Many Palestinians do not have access equally to resources. Sometimes electricity is taken out. Sometimes water gets shut down. Access of movement. I can't go into areas A in the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. They can't go sometimes into area C or into Israel without work permits. So there's a reality, a status quo that exists that is unjust across the board. And there are things that happen occasionally, terrorism on one side or the other, that people suffer from. And this is something that we all need to work to change. But when someone is investing their energy in trying to manipulate the situation and trying to play on people's genuine, sort of feeling towards, I want to have compassion toward a group of people, and playing on that compassion to manipulate to get them to be against one side or the other, that is fuel for the conflict. And so in this video, basically, what you see in a lot of these videos is anything happening before the actual interaction of, violence or brutal arrest or whatever it is, everything is cut out from before. And when you actually look at the full footage, you understand, okay, there was a protest that was illegal to have there. Then that protest became violent. The IDF soldiers came and asked them to leave, asked them to leave, asked them to leave. You can't be here, you can't be here. And they intentionally did not leave. And why do you have over a dozen photographers there, if not to capture things on film intentionally? You think every single individual is walking on the street in Israel and under the Palestinian Authority and is walking with dozens of photographers around? No, it was intentionally to get things on film. And also the elderly guy, which, yeah, he was in his 60s, but he looked pretty healthy to me, is walking with a cane, which is fine. But, does everyone walk with a cane with a flag attached to it? So there's a Palestinian flag attached to his cane, intentionally to come and to create this image of an elderly man being arrested by an IDF soldier. And he was also resisting arrest. So the IDF soldier had to use a little bit of force, get the handcuffs behind, the zip tie. And eventually when that was done, he let go and he was carried away in a respectful manner. So I'm against the fact that we even need to be in a situation where arrests need to be done. I envision a future where the IDF isn't in Judea and Samaria, because this is where civilians are. We should have police. in civilian areas. We shouldn't have the military, but because of the status quo that exists right now, this is the situation. And the situation has to change. But to intentionally create conflict and scenarios where you're cutting videos out, creating a scenario in the first place, and using that scenario in order to demonize another side, that's just continuing this conflict. So I believe we should call out wrong where it exists, whether it's on the side of Israel or the Palestinians. But we also need to call out when people are intentionally manipulating things in order to push this agenda of one versus the other, because I think this is the culprit of why we're still in a struggle today.
I agree completely. And I think that helps when we see future scenarios that come out, we can look at it with that critical eye that you're suggesting. I love that you show the truth on social media as well, showing Israelis and Palestinians working together, eating together, which is also what I've known my whole life, all the time that I've spent in Israel. It's been the same way. So I'm wondering if this is your way to heal the culture and the minds of the younger generation. And is this the way towards a solution where we can build one land together?
Yeah, so the way I look at it is, first of all, there's no reality where Palestinians nor Israelis disappear. So the option of one side being completely demolished by the other is just not a reality. Of one side being completely kicked out by the other is not a reality. Of continuing the status quo is horrible for both sides. So the last option that comes about is figuring out ways to move forward. And in my opinion, again, there's no reality where either population disappears. So it must be that we need to find a way to live together. Now, something that's very unique to the younger generation is we grew up way more interconnected than previous generations because of social media, because we have applications like Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and TikTok, and we can see the faces, hear the stories, understand the perspective, see the art, and see the different things. And because we've grown up in an era with social media where we know how to connect very easily to others and see the story, we're also a generation that can envision a possibility of living together. And this is something that I notice very frequently amongst the youth, is that they're seeking for something that brings them together. Whereas older generations are kind of like seeking the solution where the other disappears. And so I really try to invest a lot of my efforts that I live here in Israel. I'm part of a movement called Habayit, which unites grassroots leaders from the bottom up to create that future reality. Because in what you have today with the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli governments not having great relations with each other, both sides are kind of faulty in the way they work themselves. Because if you look at the Israeli government, it's not like they are creating the conflict, but because of the structures of the political system in Israel, the politicians focus on short-term solutions in order to get reelected. And this conflict is not going to be solved by short-term solutions. It's going to be solved by shifting the culture on the long term and creating the realities and conditions for this conflict to end, meaning removing the physical and psychological walls within our minds, creating opportunity of trade, and creating a reality that actually works for both by removing the injustices and fulfilling the aspirations of both peoples. Now, there are many ideas in how this can be created. For example, a federation plan, an emirate plan. There are ways of creating a solution that works both for Jews and Palestinians. But unfortunately, we haven't been trying to find those things because we've been divided and basically been taught this narrative that they're our enemy, they want your destruction, they're your enemy, they want your destruction. And the only way to move forward is by kind of removing the other person. But that mentality is actually what I think traps us into not being able to move forward. So Habayit, what we do on a grassroots level is we unite the local leaders. Because if you look at the Palestinian Authority, they're on their, I believe, 15th or 16th year of their 4-year term. They're a total dictatorship, and no Palestinian sees them as a legitimate authority. So if you go to certain communities like in Ramallah, like in Nablus, such as Shem, or in Hebron, the real leaders are the families that lead the communities and the heads of those families. So we're trying to unite those actual local leaders that really represent the people with leaders on the side of Israel that really represent the people, and engage with one another in order to understand the other story, the suffering, the grievances, the aspirations that they seek to achieve, and to build from there. Because I think the mindset of saying, okay, I have the solution, or this is the solution that is going to be opposed, is a wrong mindset to have. And I'll explain why. I'll give an analogy. If I'm an artist, for example, before I pick the frame on the masterpiece or painting that I'm going to create, I need to first pick the canvas, the size, the texture, pick the paintbrushes, the paint, the colors, start painting, come up with an idea, change the idea, mess up, fix it. And when I finish my painting, I take a step back and then I say, well, you know what, on this painting, I think a thick wooden frame works or a thin metallic frame works. So talking about a solution is like talking about a frame before actually the artists are coming together, which are Israelis and Palestinians, and engaging in one another what type of painting they want to build. Of course, we can have theoretical ideas of what type of frame would work, but maybe by the time we get there, a different frame will fit. And there are obstacles that will have to be overcome. But until we come together and go on that path together, we're never going to get to the final frame that will work for this conflict. So I think it's healthy to theorize some sort of ideas, but never to push out as I have the answer or I am the answer or this is the only way, because the way will be built by both from the bottom up in order to fix the injustices that both experience and fulfill the needs and aspirations that both have, which are different for both.
I love your method. I think it's excellent. And one question that I think is going to be very useful to our listeners, because we have thousands of college students that listen to this podcast online, and they're probably wondering right now, how should today's college students combat anti-Semitism that is happening on college campuses in the United States? What's your advice to them?
Sure. So first we need to understand what kind of xenophobia is anti-Semitism and how relevant it is. If you look at New York Police Department crime rates and you take up all the crime rates on hate crime that exist within New York City, half of those are against the Jewish people. And the Jewish people make up a minority. Yes, there are a lot of Jews in New York City, but they make up a minority of New York City, and yet half of the hate crime rates in New York are against the Jewish people. So clearly anti-Semitism is not only relevant, but is at a peak and is growing every single year, is like multiplying every single year. So it is an issue. The way it is being expressed on college campuses is that there are movements to delegitimize, demonize the Jewish people and to sort of make their identity something different than it is, to minimize their experiences in the past, and to push an agenda that is trying to destroy and remove the rights of the Jewish people. So the way it's expressed today is through anti-Zionism. Now we need to be able to define Zionism to understand what it is and what being against or anti-Zionism actually means. We need to first understand what Zionism means. So Zionism as a definition is the right for the Jewish people to self-determine on the ancestral homeland. So the Tibetans wanting to free Tibet, the Native Americans wanting to live on the reservation, the Aboriginals wanting to live on their land, not necessarily to create a country, because different indigenous peoples have different aspirations. The Tibetans do want a country, the Jews do want a country, the Kurds do want a country because of something that they had, but other peoples like Native Americans don't believe in destroying America and creating a country, because their ideology is that land is what owns the man and not man that owns the land. So it's different ideologies for different peoples. The way anti-Zionism is expressed is basically trying to get people to the conclusion that Zionism is this evil ideology that is colonialism and oppression and apartheid, and trying to attach all sorts of evil words to a concept that just means the self-determination movement for the Jewish people, to get people psychologically to the conclusion that they should be against Zionism, which is something positive. And again, they're using intersectionality to spread this idea across campuses. So I think we need to first understand that the formula for anti-Semitism is finding the source of suffering and pain and evil that exists within an event or within a community or within a society or that exists within the world, and blaming that on the Jewish people. And then delegitimizing who the Jewish people are, trying to pretend that Jews are somehow white, which we are not, because being white is not only about your skin color. Because if it was, then, there are people with certain diseases where their skin color is white that are living in Africa and they're not white. There are Asians that are much paler in skin color and they're not white. So being white isn't only about a skin color, it's about having your identity and origins and history from Europe, and also having a white status in Europe. And Jews, even Ashkenazi Jews, which have had an experience in Europe, aren't European. Not genetically, not linguistically, not historically, not in any single way. They only had an displaced experience in Europe. So we're not white, and even in terms of status, we were never treated as whites in Europe. In fact, 6 million Jews were killed because we weren't white. And even before that, we had the Inquisitions, we had the pogroms, we had the Black Plague blamed on us. We weren't allowed to participate in agrarianism or own land. So even I think the best way to actually figure out if someone is white or not is by going to a white supremacist and asking, is that person white? And you'll go to any white supremacist and ask them, are the Jews white? And they'll tell you no. So people are trying to make Jews white to make us seem as if we don't originate from Israel, or that we are part of this powerful class that is oppressing others. And that is actually how systemic anti-Semitism functions in white societies, is by blaming the Jews for the problems that the top commits against the bottom and attaching us to that source of evil. So once we understand how anti-Semitism works, we have to be able to spot it on college campuses when professors are pushing or student groups are pushing these ideas that Israel and the Jewish people are committing all these atrocious things and appropriating other things that happen to other peoples or are happening right now to other peoples and attaching that to Israel and the Jewish people. So again, if someone is not a Palestinian or not an Israeli and wants to help either or both, their energy that they're investing has to be something that unites both and creates a holistic vision of how both can live together. If you're investing anything that puts one over the other or one against the other, then you are a part of the problem.
I love it. You know, the other interesting thing I think for you is that you have a huge following on social media, places like Instagram and many others. Are you surprised by the outpouring of support for your work on social media?
I mean, yes and no. In a way, it wasn't like I woke up one day and I had 80,000 followers on Facebook. It's been gradual throughout time, so it wasn't so shocking. But for the reason I think for why there's so much success and so many people following me on social media is because I'm giving access to information that was before inaccessible. For example, how do we explain Judaism? Why is it not a religion? You know, why are Jews not white? You know, what is the history of this land? And trying to make it digestible for a lot of people, because most people don't read books and articles anymore. They kind of watch videos, and videos have to be very interactive. They have to be, you know, a certain length that aren't too long to not get someone bored. So I'm trying to create content in a way that the audience that I'm trying to speak to, which is the next generation of Jews and non-Jews and allies and everyone else that is really going to be the future political and ideological class of the next generations, and giving them access to information that previously was inaccessible. And I think because a lot of people are hungry for those answers or are experiencing anti-Semitism and weren't taught how to respond to it, that sort of watching videos of me dealing with it and dealing with it in a respectful, intellectual way that actually is productive, it's kind of giving them the answers that they're looking for. And I think that because of that, a lot of people tend to follow my work. And it's also, I'm not someone that's ever trying to demonize or hurt another people. To the contrary, I'm trying to bring peoples together and bridge gaps and build bridges between communities. And I think because of that, also people that are usually supposed to be on the other side of me tend to agree with my opinions and say, oh, this is what we should be investing our time in and our energy in, something that brings us together rather than investing our energy in fighting each other.
That's excellent. I think if you want to build a big following on social media, follow what Rudy does, because he's got the formula down, and that's absolutely fantastic. You know, the other thing, this is something that I didn't think to ask you before, but I'm thinking about it now because I love good food. I'm hungry right now, and I'm really missing the falafel from Israel. I got to be honest with you. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. I can't get good falafel here anywhere. I just can't find the same quality foods here in the United States. So I'm wondering, what's your favorite traditional Jewish meal that somebody could cook for you?
So I love a lot of food. I think like when it comes to falafel, hummus, tuna, shawarma, all these things that are like pop culture, Middle Eastern, Mediterranean food,
Yeah,
it's not only Israeli, it's not only Lebanese, it's not only Jordanian and Egyptian, it's Middle Eastern. You know,
sure.
in a lot of cultures kind of have this clash of trying to claim this food for them, but it's a food that unites all of us, because end of the day, all Middle Easterners are cousins. We speak similar versions of a similar language. We have similar cultures, same idea of this oneness of a higher power above us. But for me, you know, when it comes to something that's very unique that has sort of an Israeli twist, you know, I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but it's the first thing that comes to mind. I would say the green shakshuka, because you know, you have shakshuka, which is usually tomato sauce and eggs, but green shakshuka has a little like twist with some spinach and broccoli. So it's usually something I like to get in the mornings.
Sounds delicious. I absolutely love it. So we have a lot of listeners here in the United States. Maybe they're listening right now and they're getting all kinds of new information they didn't have before. How can our listeners support your work, support your projects, follow you? How can they get involved?
Sure. Well, first of all, if they want to follow my work and see my videos, you can go on Rudy Rochman on Facebook, on Rudy_Israel on Instagram. The reason why it's Israel is not because of the country of Israel. My Hebrew name is Israel, so that's why it's like that. Or on YouTube or on Twitter, you can follow me and watch my videos there. If you want to get involved, I would say that every individual has their own setting, and that setting changes with time. So you can be at first on a college campus, then graduate and be a more professional space. Every individual also has different sets of skills. One could be good with public speaking, one could be good with artwork and with medicine and with creativity or something. Everyone has their own skills, and with time you also gain more skills. So I think every individual has to ask themselves a question: how can I make this world a better place? How could I spread light where there is darkness? And we all have our own way, and that way can also change with time. One day we'll all be parents, hopefully, for those who want kids. And so there's another element there that we need to pass on and educate and empower and spread lights to the next generation. So we have to ask ourselves every day, how do I make this world a better place? If you want to get involved when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, always focus and remind yourself that any work and energy that you invest in this conflict has to be to unite both peoples in order to end the injustice and help them fulfill their aspirations. If you're putting energy into it that makes one versus the other or attacking the other side, that is actually something that will eventually hurt both peoples, because our liberations are actually the key for each other to achieve liberation.
I absolutely love it. Thank you so much. This interview has been absolutely incredible. So I really appreciate the time that you've spent here. Hopefully our listeners, if you like it, please like this video, please share it. I want Rudy to get to college campuses and college students everywhere in the country, because this message is so, so important. So thank you so much, Rudy, for spending time with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me and giving me a platform.
Of course, it's my pleasure. And thank you so much to our listeners. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll see you on the next episode of Fraternity Foodie. Bye for now.